Hey everybody, today we'll be looking at the Reconstruction period from 1863 to 1877. Let me just put that year in there just for emphasis. 1863 to 1877. So the overarching essay prompt is you'll be writing a 5 to 8 paragraph essay responding to the following essay prompt. Discuss the two constitutional theories that evolved around the question of Reconstruction, and describe the three phases of Reconstructions, its successes and its failures. So today we'll be starting with Concept One, discuss the two constitutional theories that evolved around the question of Reconstruction. Once you're done listening to this lecture, you're going to want to look at Lesson 39, Presidential and Congressional Reconstruction. You want to look at that lesson to help you further respond to this particular essay prompt. All right, so let's see here. All right, good. So discuss presidential Reconstruction and show how its weaknesses would lead to Congressional Reconstruction. So Reconstruction has been a subject of discussion in the North since the beginning of the war. Reconstruction had been talked about by Lincoln and what would happen once the war was over. As usual, the discussion took place on the plane of constitutional theory. So the constitutional controversy centered around two main points. Were the seceded states in or out of the Union when rebellion was crushed? So that's the first question. The second question, I'm going to go in a lot of detail on the first question, but just to beat to the punch, the second question is who would control the reconstructional process, the president or Congress, right? So were the states, dealing with the first question, were the seceded states in or out of the Union when rebellion was crushed? From the northern premise, the secession was illegal. Strict logic reached the conclusion that the former states of the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America, had always been and were now states of the Union with all the rights and privileges pertaining thitherto. So this would be the president's, President Lincoln, and then later President Johnson's view on it. President Johnson would be the president that would assume power after the unfortunate assassination of Lincoln. So the states had never left the Union. It was illegal to secede from the Union from the first place. So they had all the rights as states to begin with, right? Both President Lincoln and Johnson supported this view. They saw the states as indestructible, and they were never out of the Union for the simple reasons that they could not be. This theory was vigorously opposed by the radical leaders, the radical Republicans in Congress, and they received judicial support in the Supreme Court case of Texas versus White, when Chief Justice Chase, speaking for the majority, stated, "The Constitution and all its provisions looks to an indestructible union composed of indestructible states. Considered, therefore, as transactions under the Constitution, the ordinance of secession, and all acts of her legislative intended to give effect to that ordinance were absolutely null." In other words, they couldn't have seceded in the first place. They were utterly without operation in law. The obligation of the state as the member of the Union remained perfect and unimpaired, despite the war, in other words. It certainly follows that the state did not cease to be a state, nor her follows the state, nor her citizens to be citizens of the Union. If this were otherwise, the states must have become foreign, and her citizens foreigners. The war must have ceased to be a war for the suppression of the rebellion, and must have become a war for conquest and subjugation. Our conclusion, therefore, is that Texas continued to be a state, and a state of the Union. So this is the Supreme Court deciding basically reaffirming President Lincoln and then later President Johnson's understanding of what secession was all about. Really didn't really even exist. If, on the contrary, secession was valid, the South might consistently be treated as a conquered territory without any legal rights that the Union was required to respect. The radical Republicans in Congress managed to prove to their satisfaction that the Southern states had lost or forfeited their rights and therefore could be treated as conquered states. Upon what theory, then, could Reconstruction proceed, would be the big question. If the states were still in the Union, it was only the citizens who were out of their normal relations with the federal government, and these could not be restored through the pardoning power of the president. This theory was supported both by Lincoln and Johnson. So let me make sure I went over that correctly. So upon what theory then could Reconstruction proceed? If the states were still in the Union, it was only the citizens who were out of their normal relations of the federal government, and these could be restored through the pardoning power of the president. Again, Lincoln and Johnson would support this theory. While brushing aside embarrassing legal obstacles, radical congressional leaders sought refuge in constitutional dialects to justify their military rule of the South. Their argument was based on the clause in the Constitution that the United States shall guarantee to every state a republican form of government. Yet, for 3/4 of a century, this clause had been interpreted to mean that Congress would sustain the pre-existing governments. But now radical Republicans wrenched it away from the traditional meanings and insisted that, for the southern states at least, a republican form of government included black suffrage. Right, and this is going to be a major sticking point for white Southerners. However, at the beginning of Reconstruction era, only 6 northern states permitted the blacks to vote, and 2 new states, Nebraska and Colorado, tried to come into the Union with suffrage limited only to whites. So there's a bit of a double standard going on. And again, so this leads to the second constitutional question: who should control the Reconstruction process, the president or Congress? Right? They have 2 different views on what secession meant and how to bring them back into the Union. And so there's going to be a big fight. And we'll look at that more in Concept 2. So see you in Concept 2. Take care. Let me know if you have any questions about this concept.